In simple terms, unconscious bias training is a series of diversity trainings, tests, assessments that are meant to help people become more aware of their personal bias and create a more inclusive society. Is unconscious bias training the solution? Recent articles and studies question the effectiveness of unconscious bias training.
Why do we need unconscious bias training? In the U.S., citizens are legally protected from discrimination on race, color, religion, sex, national origin, pregnancy, age, disability, and genetic information. The Equal Employment Opportunity Commission is charged by the federal government to enforce the laws passed by Congress and signed by the President. By law, companies cannot discriminate against employees, and yet we know that discrimination and bias still exist. There are myriad types of biases: making decisions based on preconceived stereotypes, not wanting to make decisions that would disrupt the status quo, only choosing those who are like you, couching a bias in a kindness, making a decision based on the first piece of information you have, only listening to the information that confirms your preconceptions, or seeing bias in others while ignoring or being blind to your own bias. Noon, 2018, defined several different types of racism, such as overt versus covert, conscious versus unconscious, and individual versus institutionalized. Noon argues that UBT must be tailored to fit the type of racism or bias inherent in different organizations, or it may not work. In organizations that lack racial, ethnic, and gender diversity, unconscious bias training makes organizations feel like they are reducing discrimination, systemic racism, and inequity by making their employees, quote, less biased. According to Mannis and Conway-Clausen, 2017, organizations rely on UBT to change thoughts and attitudes instead of enforcing laws that force employers and employees to act fairly. Clark, 2008, asserts that, quote, hauling employees in for a bout of training to show they harbor blind spots has become a go-to fix on the equality front. In the U.S. alone, it is estimated companies spend $8 billion a year on diversity training. No wonder. It is relatively cheap, easy to deploy, and far gentler than telling employees they are nasty chauvinists. Quote, Glenn Lopez, 2017, of Forbes, contends that, quote, trainings designed to help non-diverse populations better understand how diverse populations naturally think and act in the workplace and what motivates them have fueled divisions and silos, not eliminated them. They perpetuate the idea that diverse people are a problem that must be solved, not that these individuals can define and redefine the business and reinvent growth. Most organizations truly believe that unconscious bias training helps their employees understand their biases, and in doing so, that they will change their behavior. There are several recent examples involving companies that mandated unconscious bias training for their employees in response to racially sensitive incidents that occurred within their organizations. One such incident involved pizza chain Papa John's, whose founder and chairman of the board, John Schnatter, used a racial slur on a conference call and ultimately resigned. The organization reacted by mandating diversity and unconscious bias training for all of its employees. A second example occurred with the Napa Valley wine train, when a group of predominantly African American women were removed from the train for purportedly causing a disturbance by laughing too loud. It was reported that white passengers on the train were behaving in a similar manner, but the train staff did nothing to address their behavior. The conceptual framework of unconscious bias training incorporates the elements of awareness, action, and outcome. Conceptually, the training is supposed to make trainees aware that unknown biases exist, provide tools to eliminate those trains of thought, and thus ultimately eliminate discriminatory behaviors. However, the effectiveness of unconscious bias training is often debated and criticized for its ineffectiveness to create long-term sustainable change. More effective education methods include ongoing training, tangible behaviors, and results in policy change. Research also suggests, though, that UBT may actually have negative implications, including stereotypical thinking and increasing prejudice. What does the research say? According to Williamson and Foley, 2018, UBT invites businesses to see it as a silver bullet to achieve equity. as a one-time, one-size-fits-all solution to the problem. And it may actually entrench and normalize bias. Without a sustained commitment to cultural change and training, UBT may simply not work. Noon 2018 cautions that just knowing about bias doesn't automatically lead to a change in behavior, and that even if it has the potential to change behavior, the training would have to depend on the type of racism in that environment. And depending on the type of racism, it may not even work if it's entrenched or covert. Instead of UBT, organizations should focus on changing behavior through policy, procedure, work practices, and through the enforcement of laws. According to Manns and Conway class in 2017, this aim can be facilitated through cultural competence or cultural intelligence training. Goodman, 2012, asserts that, quote, having cultural intelligence, or CQ, means acquiring cultural awareness of self and others, recognizing ethnocentrism, understanding the consequences of cultural assumptions, and learning ways to promote effective working relations, styles of doing business around the world, cultural differences in communication styles, and the impact of virtual communications on intercultural understanding. According to Goodman, 2012, metrics are an important means for gauging whether cultural competence training efforts are working for the organization. This data should be used to continually improve elements of the overarching program and sustain effectiveness. Goodman contends that, quote, analysis of communication and decision-making before and after training, as well as an analysis of the proper financials and statistics on product development, quote, are effective means for linking behavior change to cultural competence training. If companies decide to implement unconscious bias training, they should commit to sustained, measurable training that is cognizant of the different types of bias and discrimination that may be present in their organization, both on an individual and institutional level. They should consider the thoughts and perspectives of diverse populations. And finally, organizations should welcome and see diversity as a benefit and not as a problem to be solved.